The day Gerald Whitmore laughed at the watch, nobody said a word. That was the part that stayed with Finn Calloway long after everything else had faded. Not the laugh itself, which was short and dismissive, barely worth calling a laugh, more like a breath pushed out through the nose. It was the silence after it. 8 people standing in the kitchen of his mother's house in Sudbury, Ontario, and not one of them said a thing. Finn was 41 years old that Sunday. He had driven 4 hours from his apartment in Sault Ste. Marie, with his daughter Wren sleeping in the back seat, and a casserole his sister-in-law had asked him to bring, even though she didn't actually want him there. He could feel that. He had gotten good at feeling things like that over the past 2 years, in the quiet way a person develops new senses after losing one they depended on. His wife, Claire, not Claire Beaumont from the list, a different Claire entirely, Claire Theriot from Timmins, had died 26 months before that Sunday, in January, on a morning so cold the windows of the hospital had fogged from the inside. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. Wren had been 6 years old. Finn had not been doing well, and everyone knew it, and nobody quite knew what to do with that information except to invite him to Sunday dinners where he sat at the corner of the table and answered questions about Wren's school with the minimum number of words required. He was not trying to be difficult, he was simply very, very tired. The watch had come from a box he'd found at a flea market on the edge of Highway 17 the previous Saturday, one of those sprawling outdoor setups where farmers sell preserves next to old men selling hockey cards. It was a small cardboard box, lid missing, stuffed with what someone had clearly considered junk. A broken compass, 3 mismatched cufflinks, a woman's hat pin, and at the bottom, under a piece of yellowed newspaper, the watch. He almost didn't pick it up. It was ugly, to be honest. A man's pocket watch, silver or something meant to look like silver. The case scratched and dull, one corner of the face cracked along the bottom. The chain was missing. The watch was not running. But there was something about the weight of it when he turned it over in his palm. Something about the way the hinge on the back case opened when he pressed the release, revealing the movement inside. Still intact, gears and springs all present, just stopped. And there was something engraved on the inside of the back case, small script that took him a moment to read in the outdoor light. For RT, who understands what time is for, he gave the man $2 for it. The man looked relieved to be rid of it. On the drive home with Wren, he'd held the watch in his lap at red lights, turning it over, studying the way the movement was laid out. He had grown up watching his father work on clocks and watches at the kitchen table, had spent more Saturday afternoons than he could count sitting across from him, handing him tiny screwdrivers when asked. His father, Leonard Calloway, had not been a professional watchmaker. He'd driven a fuel truck for a petroleum company for 32 years, but he'd had the hands for it, the patience, and a collection of broken timepieces he'd been accumulating since the 1970s that his mother called Leonard's expensive hobby, and his father called something worth understanding. Leonard had died when Finn was 34, 7 years ago, and sometimes it still ambushed him. He brought the pocket watch to the Sunday dinner because Wren had asked to bring it, the way children ask to bring things that interest them, wanting to show the adults in their lives what they've found. Wren had spent 20 minutes that morning studying it at the kitchen table, turning it over, asking her father what the engraving meant. He told her he didn't know yet. She decided the initials stood for someone named Roger Terrence, which she announced was a very good name. At dinner, Wren told her grandmother about the watch before the food was even on the table, and his mother, Doreen Calloway, had passed it around the table with the kind of careful respect she gave all things she didn't entirely understand. It went to Finn's older brother Patrick. No, wait, his older brother's name was not Patrick. His older brother's name was Dale. Dale Calloway, who worked in municipal planning in Barrie and had opinions about most things. Dale turned the watch over twice, said it was an interesting old piece, and passed it to his wife. And then it reached Gerald Whitmore. Gerald was the husband of Finn's cousin Becky, a man who had married into the extended Calloway family 6 years ago and had spent the time since positioning himself as the one who knew about valuable things. He had a house in Oakville with a wine cellar. He talked about the wine cellar often. He had once at Christmas given everyone a 15-minute explanation of why the olive oil he'd brought as a gift was superior to anything available at a regular grocery store. Gerald turned the watch over once, looked at the face, looked at the back, and made the sound, that short exhale through the nose. Then he set it down next to his water glass and said, "Flea market find." Finn said yes. Gerald nodded in that way that isn't really a nod, more a slow lowering of the chin that means "as I suspected." "There's a lot of that stuff going around," he said. "People think they're finding antiques. Usually it's just old." He picked up his fork. That was the moment, that was the silence. 8 people, and nobody said anything because what was there to say, and because Gerald had a confidence that filled a room the way certain sounds fill a room. Not loudly but completely, leaving no space for other sounds to grow. Finn picked up the watch from next to Gerald's water glass, put it in his jacket pocket, and ate his dinner. He didn't say a word about it for the rest of the meal. He'd started fixing watches 6 months earlier, in the same cautious, half-embarrassed way a person starts doing anything they're not sure they have a right to do. After Claire died, the apartment in Sault Ste. Marie had become a problem to be in. Not because it was sad exactly, though it was that, but because it was quiet in a way that felt pressurized, like the quiet before something happens. Ren went to bed at 8:30, and Finn would sit on the couch, and there was just the refrigerator hum and the occasional sound of a car on the street outside, and the specific quality of air in a place where someone used to be and isn't anymore. He'd needed something to do with his hands. He had started with a broken alarm clock from his own bedside table, the kind of project his father would have recognized immediately. He'd found a repair manual online. He'd made a mess of it the first time, got it running the second time, felt something ease slightly in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Then he'd bought a broken watch at a thrift store for $3. Then another. He'd set up a corner of the kitchen table, careful to keep Ren's side clear, with a small lamp and a set of watchmaker's tools he'd ordered online, and on the nights Ren was asleep and the refrigerator hummed, he sat there and worked on small mechanical things, and it was the closest he'd felt to his father since his father had died, and the closest he'd felt to himself since Claire had died, and he was not prepared to explain any of that to anyone. Ren had named his corner of the table the Clock Hospital. She brought him broken toys sometimes and asked if he could help them too. He usually could. The flea market on Highway 17 he'd been visiting most Saturdays since October, partly for the watches and clock parts that occasionally turned up, partly because it was an outdoor thing to do with Ren that cost almost nothing and let her run around in the fresh air while he looked at boxes of old things. She had developed a habit of finding him when she spotted something she thought might be interesting and leading him by the hand to wherever it was. She'd found the pocket watch herself, actually. She'd pointed to the box and said, "Daddy, look at that old box," and he'd been the one to dig through it. He owed her the $2, technically. That evening after the Sunday dinner, back in his apartment, Ren asleep, he sat at his corner of the table and opened the back case of the pocket watch again under his lamp. The movement was Swiss. He could see that immediately now that he had proper light and his loop. Older than he'd initially thought. The style of the bridge work, the shape of the balance wheel cock. These things he'd been learning to read the way his father had, slowly, with reference books and online forums and a lot of time. He cleaned the movement carefully, working piece by piece, and found it to be in remarkable condition, dust and old oil but no significant damage, no broken parts. Someone had taken very good care of this watch for a long time, and then at some point, for whatever reason, it had ended up in a cardboard box at a flea market outside Sudbury. He set the mainspring. The watch started. He sat back and listened to it tick and thought about the engraving, for RT who understands what time is for. The following week, on a Thursday evening, he posted photos of the watch to a Canadian horological forum he'd been reading for months but rarely posted on. He wasn't looking for validation. He was looking for information. He described what he'd found, described the movement, described the engraving, and uploaded 9 photographs he'd taken with his phone using the macro lens attachment he'd bought for $30. The first response came within an hour. "Can you get better photos of the movement? Specifically the cock and the barrel bridge." He got better photos, he posted them. The forum went quiet for about 20 minutes, and then a reply came from an account he recognized. A man named Bourgeois from Montreal who'd been posting on the forum for 11 years, and who Finn had come to understand, from context, was one of the more serious collectors in the country. "Where exactly did you get this?" Finn told him. "Flea Market, Highway 17, outside Sudbury." $2. There was another pause. Then Bourgeois wrote, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer carefully. Is there any marking on the movement, a serial number or a maker's signature, on the top plate? It might be very small. Get your best loop." Finn got his best loop. He found it in the lower right corner of the top plate, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, a small engraved mark, 2 initials and a year, JF 1923. He photographed it, he posted it. Bourgeois' reply came back in 4 minutes. "Don't let that watch out of your sight. I need to make some calls." Finn did not sleep well that night. He wasn't sure what Bourgeois had seen in the marking, and he was cautious enough not to leap to conclusions. He'd read enough about the antiques world to know that things that looked promising often turned out to be interesting but not extraordinary. He'd also, somewhere between getting Ren's lunch ready and trying to remember if her Thursday library book was due, looked up the initials JF in the context of Canadian watch movements from the 1920s, and found very little, which either meant nothing or meant something, and he didn't know which. Ren had noticed the watch was running that morning. She'd picked it up from the table, he'd wrapped it in a soft cloth and held it to her ear and gone very still, listening to it tick. "Is it better?" she asked. "It's running," he said. That's the same thing, she decided. He supposed it was. Bourgeois called him the next evening, which surprised Finn because he hadn't given Bourgeois his phone number. He'd gotten it from another forum member, which in a different context might have been alarming, but in this context felt like an indication of how seriously the man was taking things. The initials JF, Bourgeois said without preamble in English with a Montreal French accent that landed hard on certain consonants, stand for Jean Fortier. You will not find very much about him because he did not want to be found. He was a watchmaker in Montreal in the 1910s and 1920s who made, by most accounts, fewer than 40 watches in his entire life. He made them by hand, completely by hand, every component, including things most watchmakers of that era were buying from suppliers. He was not interested in production. He was not interested in selling. He made watches for specific people for reasons that apparently satisfied him, and then he more or less disappeared from the record after 1931. Finn sat down. "There are 11 confirmed Fortier pieces to exist," Bourgeois continued. 3 are in private collections. 2 are in museums, 1 in Montreal, 1 in Geneva. The others have passed through auctions over the past 30 years, and the lowest any of them has sold for was $180,000. That was 2009. The market has changed significantly since then. Finn looked at the watch, wrapped in its cloth on his kitchen table 10 feet away. "The most recent Fortier to come to auction," Bourgeois said, "sold in London in 2021 for $4.3 million. The refrigerator hummed. "The engraving," Finn said finally. "For RT who understands what time is for, that is consistent with Fortier's practice, he often engraved something personal on pieces he considered his best work." Bourgeois paused. "The initials RT I have a theory about. There was a man, a railway engineer in Montreal, the 1920s, by the name of Roland Taschereau. He had a reputation for extraordinary precision timing. Fortier would have known him. It's possible, not confirmed but possible, that this watch was made for him specifically." Finn thought about the man at the flea market who had looked relieved to be rid of the box. "What do I do?" he said. "I know people," Bourgeois said. "I know the right people at the right institutions and at the right auction houses. If you want, I can make introductions. You are under no obligation. But I would not sit on this for very long, and I would keep it somewhere safer than wherever it currently is." It was currently wrapped in a dishcloth on his kitchen table, 10 feet from a child's unfinished homework and a sticker of a cartoon frog that Ren had stuck to the table in September and that Finn had lacked the energy to remove. He told Dale the following weekend over the phone while Ren was at a birthday party. Dale was quiet for a long time. Then Dale said, "Finn, are you sure about this guy from the forum?" "Not entirely," Finn said honestly. "Because you know there are a lot of people who will see someone like you coming," Dale said, not unkindly, "and they'll have a story already." He knew that. He'd thought about that. But something in the specificity of what Bourgeois had told him, the detail of Jean Fortier, the documented auction history, the cross-referencing he'd done himself across 3 different sources over 2 late nights, had moved him past reasonable skepticism into something he couldn't quite call certainty, but that felt solid in a way that counted. "I'm going to have it verified independently first," Finn said. "Before anything." Dale said that was smart. He did not call Gerald Whitmore. He had not spoken to Gerald Whitmore since the Sunday dinner, and he did not feel any particular need to change that. The appraisal took 3 weeks to arrange and happened in Toronto at the office of a woman named Dr. Helena Szymanski, who had 30 years in horological authentication and whose credentials Finn had verified independently, carefully, twice. She was in her late 50s, wore her gray hair pulled back, and looked at the watch for a very long time without saying anything. Finn sat in a chair across from her desk and tried not to think about anything. Ren was with his mother in Sudbury for the week, March break, and he'd driven down to Toronto the night before and slept in a motel on the lakeshore, which was the first time he'd been alone, truly alone, in longer than he could remember. He'd sat on the edge of the motel bed and watched the lake through the window and thought about Claire, which he did most evenings regardless, but did more deliberately that night, in a way that was less like grief and more like conversation. He'd told her about the watch, which was a thing he did, talking to her. He knew she couldn't hear him. He also knew that the act of saying something out loud, forming it into words, sending it into a room, did something to the thing being said, made it more real, made it possible to see from a different angle. He'd told her about the watch and about Ren pressing it to her ear and going still, and about Gerald's exhale, and about Jean Fortier in Montreal in the 1920s, making 40 watches for no commercial reason, for people he felt deserved them. "Who understands what time is for," he'd said to the room. In Dr. Szymanski's office. She set down her loupe and looked at him over the tops of her glasses. "Where did you get this?" she said. He told her. $2, she repeated. $2, he confirmed. She looked at him for a moment in a way he couldn't entirely read. Then she said, "Mr. Calloway, what I'm going to tell you next is going to require you to stay very calm, because there are several things we need to discuss in the correct order, and they will go better if you don't react to each piece of information as if it's the last piece." He told her he would try. "This is a 40er, she said. "I am certain of that. The movement, the construction, the engraving style, these are all consistent with the known corpus. It will need to go to a second authenticator, and I will recommend one, but I want to be honest with you about my own level of certainty, which is very high." She paused. The initials JF and the year 1923 place this in what collectors consider 40 years late period, the last 6 years of his documented work. There are 3 pieces from this period that are authenticated. They are also the 3 highest-selling 40-year pieces on record. "Because of the quality?" Finn asked. "Because of the quality," she confirmed, "and because there is a theory, I hold it myself as do others in the field, that Fortier was attempting something specific in his last years, a technical approach to the escapement that his earlier pieces don't show. Whether he perfected it is a matter of some debate." She reached for the watch again and turned it over in her hand. "The mechanism in this piece, I will need more time. But my initial read is that this may be one of the clearest expressions of that approach that I have seen in any Fortier." Finn did not move. "I will not give you a dollar figure today," she said. "That is not my role and it wouldn't be responsible. But I want you to understand what I'm telling you. This is not a curiosity, this is not an interesting old piece. This is a significant historical object, and its discovery, the fact that it has been sitting at a flea market outside Sudbury, Ontario in a cardboard box, is going to matter to people, to institutions, to collectors." She looked at him steadily. "You should have legal counsel before you speak to anyone other than a second authenticator." He drove back to Sudbury the next day and picked up Wren from his mother's house. Wren ran out the front door and grabbed his hand and said, "Is the watch okay?" "The watch is very okay," he said. She seemed satisfied by this. She picked up her backpack and her stuffed rabbit, which she called Bolt for reasons Finn had never fully tracked, some private logic of a 7-year-old, and got in the car. On the highway heading north, she fell asleep. Finn drove with one hand on the wheel and the spring light coming flat and low across the shield and the boreal beginning to show green at the edges, the way it did in March in northern Ontario, tentative, uncertain, like it wasn't sure yet if it was allowed. He thought about his father, who had sat at a kitchen table in a house 12 kilometers from where Finn was now, and taken apart broken things and put them back together, and called it something worth understanding. He thought about Claire, who had once said to him, early on when they were still figuring each other out, "The thing I like about you is that you pay attention to things other people don't notice." He had not known what to say to that at the time. He didn't think he'd said anything. He'd just looked at her the way he sometimes did, because she had a way of making him feel seen that he had never quite gotten used to. He'd paid attention to a box at a flea market, he'd felt the weight of something and picked it up. Maybe that was all it was. The second authentication took another month. The legal counsel, a woman in Sault Ste. Marie who handled estate and property matters and who looked at the file with wide, careful eyes, took another 3 weeks beyond that. By the time bourgeois contacts at a major auction house in Toronto had formally assessed the piece and provided a preliminary estimated value range, it was late April, the snow had gone, and Wren had started t-ball on Saturday mornings at the park 6 blocks from their apartment. Finn watched her run the bases, or approximate running the bases, which at 7 years old meant something enthusiastic and directionally optimistic, and tried to understand what was happening to his life. The estimate, provided in writing in careful conditional language that kept reiterating that auction outcomes could not be guaranteed, suggested a range. The bottom of that range was $2.8 million. The top was not a number Finn had ever associated with himself. He'd called Dale. Dale had gone very quiet, in a way that sounded different from his usual quiet. Then Dale had said, "Finn, Leonard would have lost his mind," and Finn had laughed for the first time in a while, in a way that felt like it came from somewhere real. The auction was held in October on a Thursday. Finn did not attend in person. He sat at his kitchen table in Sault Ste. Marie, at his corner with his lamp, and watched the live stream on his laptop with Wren sitting beside him, 8 years old now, eating crackers, not fully understanding what was happening but understanding that it was important and conducting herself accordingly. He had considered not watching. He had considered having someone call him after. But Wren had found out it was being live-streamed and had asked if they could watch together, and Finn had no reasonable argument against this. The watch appeared on screen in a presentation case he didn't recognize, Black velvet, properly lit, and the auctioneer introduced it in the way auctioneers introduce things they know are significant. A certain lowering and steadying of the voice, a pause before the key words. Finn watched Ren watch the screen. She was studying the presentation of the watch with an expression of great seriousness. "That's our watch," she said. "It was our watch," he said. She considered this. "But we fixed it. We fixed it." She seemed to find this a satisfying answer. She ate a cracker. On screen, the bidding opened. Finn had been told roughly what to expect. He had also been told that live auctions have their own logic, their own momentum, and that prepared or not, the experience of watching it happen was different from anticipating it. This turned out to be accurate. He sat at his kitchen table, his father's habit, his corner, his lamp, and watched the number climb in a way that was mechanical and impersonal and somehow also felt like being handed something he didn't have the proper hands for. When it stopped, Ren said, "Is that good?" He was looking at the final number on the screen. The watch had sold for $4,700,000. "Yes," he said, "that's good." She nodded. She offered him a cracker. He took it. Later, after she was asleep, he sat at the table in the quiet, the refrigerator hum, the car on the street, and thought about Gerald Whitmore and the exhale through the nose and found that he was not angry. He had expected to feel something sharp when this moment came, some specific satisfaction, and instead what he felt was closer to tired and full at the same time, the way you feel after eating a meal that was worth making. He didn't call Gerald. He didn't need to. He had heard through Becky that the story had gotten back to Oakville through the family network. His cousin had not been able to resist, and that Gerald had responded by saying, well, of course, he'd known there was something different about the watch. He'd said as much at the time, hadn't he? Finn had heard this and felt nothing in particular. People do that, he thought. They revise. It doesn't change anything about the afternoon you spent at the kitchen table with your daughter listening to the watch tick and deciding it was better. He used part of the money to buy a house. In Sault Ste. Marie, which meant it wasn't the kind of money that bought extravagance but the kind that bought stability, which was the only kind Finn had ever understood how to want. He set aside what Ren would need for school. He gave a portion to his mother, who argued with him about it at length and then accepted it. He gave an amount to the local library that had been Ren's safe harbor through the worst of the past 2 years. He kept his corner of the kitchen table in the new house. Ren carried the lamp herself from the car very carefully, telling him she was being careful and he should notice. In the new workshop he'd made for himself, a proper room now with better lighting and a second-hand watchmaker's bench he'd found in an estate sale. He kept on a small shelf above the bench one object, a photograph of his father at the kitchen table in Sudbury, glasses on the end of his nose, bent over something small and broken, completely absorbed. There was a wooden clock on the workshop wall that Finn had built with Ren over a winter, the two of them following a kit, arguing gently about which piece went where, losing a small gear behind the radiator and finding it 3 days later. The clock kept terrible time and was beautiful. Ren came into the workshop some evenings and sat on the stool in the corner and did her reading while Finn worked. She didn't ask a lot of questions during those sessions. She seemed to understand, in the way children sometimes understand things they haven't been taught, that the quiet in that room was a particular kind of quiet, one that meant something, and that it was better to be inside it than to fill it up. One evening in December she looked up from her book and said, "Daddy, do you think the person who made the watch knew someone would find it someday?" Finn considered the question. He thought about Jean Fortier in Montreal in the winter of 1923, bent over a workbench not so different from this one, making a thing he didn't have to make. For a man he thought deserved it, engraving words on the inside of the case where almost no one would ever read them. "I think," he said carefully, "that he made it so that the person who found it would deserve to find it." Ren thought about this for a moment. "Like a test," she said. "Maybe," he said, "or like a gift. From someone who understood that the right person would come along." She went back to her book. The clock on the wall ticked its irregular, imprecise handmade tick. He went back to work.